Working nights in my world was always a balancing act of tension and precision. But tonight felt different. The office was quiet, enveloped in a hushed calm, with the soft hum of the air conditioner blending into the distant sounds of the city. The desk in front of me was cluttered with files, folders, and empty coffee cups, their faint aroma lingering in the air like a reminder of the hours slipping away. I sat across from her. Emma Clark. She wasn't just my lawyer, she was the only person I trusted with this case. She had a tenacity that was unmatched, but more than that, she was brilliant. Exceptionally brilliant. Her gaze, fixed intently on her laptop screen, seemed to cut through every obstacle. She moved with precision, her hands flying over the keyboard as if she had already solved the puzzle before her. I couldn't stop watching her. It wasn't just her focus, it was the way she seemed to forget everything else when she worked. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, a few strands falling around her face, and her features were etched with determination that made her feel almost untouchable. It drove me crazy. "Are you sure this will work?" I finally asked, breaking the silence and trying not to betray how much I had been distracted by her presence. I needed to focus, to keep my emotions in check. She looked up, her clear blue eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "It's risky," she admitted, her voice steady but layered with conviction. "But it's our best shot. If we frame the emotional appeal just right, it'll resonate. They won't be able to ignore it." She always had this way of making confidence contagious. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I trust you," I said, meaning it in a way that went beyond the case. It wasn't just her intellect or her skill, it was her essence, the force of her being that made you feel like everything might just turn out okay. For a moment, the space between us shifted. The air seemed heavier, charged with something unspoken. Emma stood, stretching slightly, and I couldn't help but follow her movements. She walked to the window, silhouetted by the faint glow of the city lights. The curve of her figure, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, it all struck me as painfully beautiful. "You've been at this for hours," I said, softer now. "You need a break." She turned to face me, her outline framed by the dim light outside. "And what about you?" "You've been here just as long," she replied, her tone laced with concern and a hint of playfulness. I stood, the room feeling smaller as I moved closer to her. I wasn't sure what compelled me, but I found myself stopping just a few feet away. The space between us felt electric, like every inch was charged with possibility. "I'm used to it," I said quietly. "But you, Emma, you carry so much. You don't have to do it alone." There was a vulnerability in my voice I hadn't intended to reveal, but once it was out, I didn't regret it. She met my gaze, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to respond but wasn't sure how. The tension between us thickened, an unspoken understanding hanging in the air. "I'm not sure I know how to let go," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I stepped closer, hesitating for only a moment before reaching out. My fingers brushed her arm lightly, testing the boundaries between us. Her skin was warm, sending a shiver through me. "Maybe you don't have to figure it out alone," I said softly, letting the words linger between us. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, we stood there, caught in a moment that felt fragile and infinite all at once. Slowly, she reached up, her fingers grazing the fabric of my shirt, resting just over my chest. I knew she could feel the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, which had quickened under her touch. She began, but her words faltered as I leaned in, my lips hovering just a breath away from hers. "You're extraordinary, Emma," I whispered, the words tumbling out as if they had been waiting for this moment. "The way you fight, the way you care, it's incredible." Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tentative and urgent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a release, a breaking of the walls we'd both been holding up for so long. Her hands slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I wrapped my arms around her, anchoring her to me. The world outside the office disappeared as the kiss deepened. Her scent, something soft and subtly floral, filled my senses, grounding me even as I felt like I was floating. My hands moved instinctively, one tracing the line of her back, the other resting against her waist, as if afraid she might vanish if I let go. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we struggled to steady ourselves. Her fingers lingered against my jaw, her touch feather-light but grounding. "This changes things," I murmured, my voice unsteady but resolute. She pulled back just enough to look at me, a faint, wry smile curving her lips. "Not everything. We still have work to do." I laughed softly, the sound breaking the intensity of the moment just enough to make it feel real. "Of course. The case comes first." But as she moved back to her desk, her fingers brushing mine for just a second longer than necessary, I knew that something between us had shifted. The barriers that had once felt insurmountable were gone, leaving in their place a connection that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. And as I watched her dive back into the files with that same fierce determination, I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what the outcome of the case, something had begun that couldn't be undone. The room returned to its quiet hum, but something had changed. Emma's focus was once again on the glowing screen in front of her, her fingers moving across the keyboard as she reviewed every line, every word, with the same meticulous care that had drawn me to her in the first place. But now, I wasn't just watching her work, I was watching her, truly seeing her in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I settled back into my chair, my pulse still quickened from our shared moment by the window. The taste of her kiss lingered on my lips, a reminder of the closeness we had dared to explore. My hand brushed the edge of the desk, restless, as I tried to ground myself in the task at hand. But how could I? My thoughts were a chaotic jumble of emotions and questions I wasn't ready to answer. For what felt like hours, we worked in companionable silence. The sound of her typing, the rustle of papers, the occasional sip of coffee, it all felt intimate, as though the act of simply being near her was enough to calm the storm inside me. Every now and then, I caught her glancing my way, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Was it curiosity? Fear? Or the same unspoken longing that had been pulling me toward her all night? At one point, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The tension in her shoulders was evident, the weight of the case, and perhaps everything else, pressing down on her. I stood without thinking, moving to the small kitchenette in the corner of the office to refill her mug. The simple act felt grounding, a way to bridge the growing intensity between us without saying anything at all. "Here," I said, setting the steaming cup on her desk. "You've earned it." She looked up, a hint of surprise softening her features. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, her voice quieter than usual. "I know," I replied, meeting her gaze. "But you're carrying both of us through this. It's the least I can do." Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that sent a warmth through me I hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, her tone genuine. She took a sip, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, and for a moment, the silence between us felt less heavy, more like a shared understanding. As the hours wore on, the city outside grew quieter. The distant hum of traffic faded, replaced by the stillness of the early morning hours. Emma's energy began to wane, her movements slower, her focus faltering. She tried to stifle a yawn, but I caught it, the sight strangely endearing. "You need sleep," I said, breaking the silence. "We're not going to get anywhere if you pass out at your desk." She looked up at me, her eyes tired but defiant. "I can't. Not yet. There's too much left to do." I moved closer, resting my hand on the back of her chair. "Emma, you've done more than enough for one night. Let it go, just for a little while." Her lips parted, as if to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she sighed, the fight leaving her as she leaned back and closed her eyes. "I don't know how to let it go," she admitted softly. Her vulnerability caught me off guard. She was always so composed, so unshakable. To see her like this, to hear the cracks in her armor, made me want to protect her in ways I couldn't fully explain. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the desk. The touch was light, tentative, but it was enough. "Come on," I said, my voice low but firm. "Just for a minute." She hesitated, her gaze searching mine for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, finally, she nodded. I helped her to her feet, my hand lingering at her elbow as I guided her to the small couch by the window. She sank into the cushions, the exhaustion evident in the way she exhaled, as though she had been holding her breath for hours. I sat down beside her, the space between us narrow but significant. For a while, neither of us spoke. The soft glow of the city lights outside cast faint patterns on the walls, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing began to steady me. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know," I said, breaking the silence. "You've got me." She turned her head to look at me, her eyes searching mine with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "I'm not used to having someone there," she admitted. "It's easier to just keep it all to myself." I reached out, my hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to keep it all in. Not with me." The moment stretched, the air between us charged with something neither of us could name. Slowly, I lifted her hand, brushing my lips against her knuckles. Her breath caught, the sound barely audible, but it sent a shiver through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted closer, her fingers intertwining with mine. Her free hand reached up, brushing against my jaw, her touch tentative but deliberate. I turned my head slightly, my lips brushing against her palm in a gesture that felt both intimate and grounding. "Ethan," she whispered, my name a breathless plea that cut through every layer of restraint I had left. I leaned in, my forehead resting against hers, our breaths mingling in the quiet. The closeness was intoxicating, the warmth of her presence enveloping me in a way that made everything else fade. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she had come to mean to me, but words felt inadequate. So I let the silence speak for me. Slowly, her fingers trailed up my arm, resting lightly against my shoulder. The gesture was hesitant, as if she was testing the boundaries of what we could allow ourselves. I covered her hand with mine, holding her gaze as I whispered, "I'm here." She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. And as I pulled her into an embrace, her head resting against my chest, I knew that this moment, this connection, was something I would never let go of. The quiet moments between us stretched into something unspoken, the kind of silence that carried its own weight. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing against me, soft and steady, like she was beginning to let go of some of the tension she'd been carrying all night. I tightened my arms around her slightly, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. She didn't pull away, didn't resist. Instead, her fingers curled against my chest, holding on to me as if I were the only thing grounding her. The world outside the window was still and dark, but inside, it felt as though everything was finally aligning. "You're different," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "Most people, clients, partners, they just want results. They don't stop to ask how I'm doing." I tilted my head slightly, my chin brushing against her hair. "Maybe it's because I see you, Emma," I said softly. "Not just the lawyer, not just the brilliant mind behind this case. I see you." Her breath hitched, and I felt her fingers tighten their grip on my shirt. "It's hard for me," she admitted after a pause. "To let someone in." I smiled faintly, my hand finding its way to her hair, my fingers brushing gently through the strands. "I think I understand that better than you realize." She pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, her eyes searching mine. "Do you?" she asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and doubt. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the couch as I gathered my thoughts. For a long time, I thought keeping people at arm's length was the only way to protect myself, I began. Trusting someone felt dangerous, like giving them the power to hurt me. But with you, it's different. Her gaze softened, and for the first time that night, she looked at me not just as a client or a colleague, but as someone she might let in. It's strange, she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Being seen like that, it's terrifying, but it's kind of nice. We sat like that for what felt like forever, our words fading into the quiet. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the push and pull of emotions she wasn't ready to name. And yet, in the space between us, there was an undeniable sense of safety. Eventually, she broke the silence. "You don't make it easy to stay guarded, you know," she said with a teasing lilt in her voice. I chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Maybe that's a good thing." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could undo a man if he wasn't careful. "Maybe," she said softly, her tone carrying the faintest hint of vulnerability. Before I could respond, she shifted closer, her head resting against my shoulder once more. This time, her movement felt deliberate, as if she was allowing herself to trust the moment. My arm draped around her, holding her to me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. "But tonight, this feels right." "It does," I agreed, my voice steady. "And tomorrow, whatever happens, we'll face it together." She didn't reply, but the way she relaxed against me was answer enough. The exhaustion of the night finally caught up to her, her breathing evening out as she drifted into a light sleep. I stayed there, holding her, watching as the first faint rays of dawn began to creep through the window. The early morning light cast a soft glow over the room, and as I watched her sleep, I couldn't help but marvel at how peaceful she looked. In that moment, she wasn't the sharp, relentless lawyer who had carried the weight of my case on her shoulders. She was just Emma, vulnerable and human, and somehow that made her even more extraordinary. When she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, I smiled down at her. "Good morning," I said softly. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, before realization dawned in her eyes. A faint blush crept up her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. "Did I fall asleep on you?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. I nodded, my smile widening. "You needed it." She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back from her face. "I'm sorry," she said, though her tone didn't carry much regret. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," I interrupted gently. "You've been running on fumes. If anything, I'm glad you let yourself rest." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe. Or something deeper. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" I asked, tilting my head. "For being here," she said simply. The vulnerability in her words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. So instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. "I'll always be here," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. "For as long as you'll have me." She smiled then, a real, unguarded smile that lit up her face. And in that moment, I knew that whatever the future held, whatever challenges lay ahead, this was the beginning of something neither of us could have anticipated. Something worth fighting for. The final days of preparation for the case passed in a whirlwind. Emma and I worked side by side, our connection growing stronger with each shared glance, every word unspoken yet understood. There was no denying what we had built, not just a professional alliance, but something deeper, something we both knew was rare. On the morning of the trial, the air in the office felt different. It wasn't just the gravity of the day ahead, it was the culmination of everything we had been through together. Emma stood by the window, her posture composed but her expression betraying the faintest trace of nerves. I approached her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You ready for this?" I asked, my voice steady. She turned to face me, her blue eyes locking onto mine. "With you here?" "Always." Her words hit me with a quiet force, grounding me in the certainty of what we had become. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The moment felt heavy with unspoken promises, but we both knew there was no time for distractions. Not yet. Let's go win this, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. The courtroom was a battlefield, every argument, every piece of evidence meticulously laid out. Emma was a force of nature, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. I sat at the defendant's table, watching her with a mixture of awe and pride. She wasn't just fighting for me, she was fighting for truth, for justice, for something bigger than either of us. As the hours stretched on, I saw the cracks of exhaustion in her armor, the weight of the case pressing down on her. But every time she faltered, her gaze would find mine, and I would nod, silently reminding her that I was there. That I believed in her. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was palpable. The words, "not guilty," echoed in my ears, a wave of relief washing over me so profound I almost couldn't breathe. I turned to Emma, who was standing frozen, her expression a mixture of disbelief and triumph. She turned to me then, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade. Without thinking, I stood and pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as the weight of everything we had fought for finally lifted. "You did it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Her arms tightened around me, her face buried against my shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly, her words muffled but no less powerful. The celebration that night was quiet, just the two of us in the office, a bottle of wine and the glow of the city lights surrounding us. The laughter came easily, the tension of the past weeks melting away as we shared stories, memories, and dreams for the future. At one point, Emma set her glass down, her expression growing serious. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but hesitant, "I've spent so much of my life building walls, convincing myself that I don't need anyone. But you've changed that." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. "You've done the same for me," I admitted. "You've shown me what it means to trust again." She smiled, a soft, vulnerable expression that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Now, we see where this goes. No walls, no pretending. Just us." Her smile deepened, and as she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, I felt the weight of the future settle into something hopeful, something worth fighting for. Months later, as we walked along the waterfront on a crisp autumn evening, I realized how much had changed. The case was behind us, the chaos of those weeks replaced by the steady rhythm of a life we were building together. Emma's laughter rang out as she teased me about something trivial, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. "You know," I said, stopping to pull her into my arms, "I think I might be the luckiest man alive." She rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Harper." I grinned, leaning down to brush a kiss against her forehead. "Good. Because I'm not planning on letting you go." Her expression softened, and she reached up to touch my face, her hand warm against my skin. "I'm not planning on going anywhere." As we stood there, the city lights shimmering on the water, I felt something I hadn't in years, peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them together. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like more than enough.